The Horizon EU OceanICU is a 5-year project that seeks to gain a new understanding of the biological carbon pump and its processes in order to provide fundamental knowledge and tools to help policymakers and blue economy regulators understand the impact of their actions on ocean carbon. This will ultimately lead to a better approach for addressing climate change in alignment with the EU Green Deal to reduce the net emissions of greenhouse gases to zero by 2050.
So, hello, my name is Richard Sanders and I work in NORCE, which is a big research centre in Bergen in Norway. But the work that I do is mainly around a European research infrastructure called ICOS, which exists to make observations of the ocean and land and atmospheric carbon cycles across Europe.
Yeah, hello, my name is Toste Tanhua. I'm a chemical oceanographer working at GEOMAR Helmholtz Centre for Ocean Research Kiel in northern Germany. And I've been doing marine science for more than 30 years, focusing on trace gases, but increasingly on how to make sustained ocean observations on chemistry and physics and biology for the benefit of processes like the COP.
This is Conversations with Scientists, an OceanICU podcast series, Episode 1, Demystifying the COP.
So I guess we're talking about the climate COP. I mean, this year has been 3 different COPs, and COP means Conference of the Parties. So the other ones that are important in this connection is the Biodiversity COP that was held in Colombia and the COP on combating desertification that is held in Saudi Arabia. And this one is about the Climate Convention, United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change, UNFCCC. And this is where the members of the conventions, the countries, the nations that sign up to this convention some 30 years ago, that they meet once a year and discuss progress and try to move forward. That is the COP.
But it's been invested with a huge amount of sort of importance in people's mind. So it's this quite important annual point in the annual cycle for many, many people. Lots and lots of people flying to it. And I've only ever been once. Toste's a much more regular attendee. But of course, it tends to make a lot of waves in the climate community and more broadly as well.
I think that's a really important point. It really puts the climate issue on the agenda on politicians, but also the general public and scientists, not to forget. And that is an important milestone. But remember that within the convention, there are many other important meetings throughout the year. And this is kind of the climate or the climax, the big bang by the end of the year when you try to get these high level agreements. But a lot of the works is actually happening at other areas of the convention and in the nations, of course, when the nations discuss how they're going to comply to the agreements they have made so far and how they're going to react to suggestions for new agreements in the next COP. So it's a little bit of a big showplace, but a benchmark for the years, and then you look forward to the next one.
So when I attended, I was really struck by the sort of almost layers of activity that go on. So at esse core, it's official delegates from countries who are really arguing over precise wordings of texts, but then around in a particularly segregated part of the whatever venue's chosen. But then around the outside of that, there's these sort of layers of activity ranging from individual countries who have pavilions to present their own perspectives, businesses that want to contribute to the process of managing climate change, civil society organisations who want to apply pressure to the system, scientists who want to turn up and present what they consider to be particularly important activities. So it's a pretty confusing place. And, I found it hard to navigate through the process to actually figure out, and I don't even know if I did in the end, what the real important core of it was. You've been to more, Toste. Have you got a feeling for, if you had to distill it down to 10% of its size, which bit would really need to stay?
Yeah, I did a count just before this call, and I counted this was the seventh one I attended. It's still a mystery for me, Richard, how this works. As you said, there are the official mandated parts of the COP, and then there is all the pavilions and scientists and interest groups that want to have an impact on there. So there is a lot of things going on. One thing that's very important for us as scientists is the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice, the SABSTA. This is really where we can have impact, and where we do have impact and influence on. And that is probably one of the things that I really would keep on the COP. And of course, the high-level negotiations and the other subsidiary bodies. There has been suggestions to move those that are not directly engaged in the negotiations on the delegations, to move them to kind of another place, another time, to make the COP more, make it a little bit smaller and more compact. It might be a good idea. In Dubai, there was, I think, 100,000 participants, which is huge, right? I mean, it's amazing. And how can you really get your voice heard in such a big fora? It's hard for me to say what you would keep, but there are the mandated parts of the COP that you really need to have. The subsidiary bodies and the main negotiations, those need to be there. But I think there would be a shame if they didn't have a chance to listen to scientists, for instance, or indigenous groups or other interest groups, what they have to say. And that this provides actually that forum where you can walk in the corridors and suddenly you bump into your prime minister or your minister for environment walking, with somebody around.
So I think that's a really important point. It is one of the few events that I've ever been to in my professional life, or indeed my personal life actually, where really senior politicians have been present. I remember still actually sitting in the conference centre in Glasgow, and all of a sudden there was kind of a sort of a rush and an excitement in the air. And then, I forget who it was exactly, but it was a senior member of the United States delegation kind of swept past with his entourage around him on his way to the pavilion where he was due to speak. And there was a sort of a palpable sense of, excitement in the air that really you were listening to the people that make the climate waves here. What they say counts. So, it might not be the most profitable or intense interaction, but it's the only place I've ever been where there is really an interaction between senior decision makers and grassroots scientists. And that is something that, at least in principle for me, is worth preserving.
Yeah, I completely agree there, Richard. I think that's super important. But at the same time, there is a need, I think, to keep it a little bit smaller. I don't know what the number is going to be. 100,000 seems very excessive to me.
Yeah. It's interesting you bring up the number because, there is a school of thought, and I'd be interested in your views on this, that the simple, that 100,000 people ranking this so highly that they're prepared to go there, they're prepared to invest time, research budgets, money, and so on to kind of turn up, gives it a sort, gives an air of sort of importance and emphasises the importance of the climate negotiations themselves that you just wouldn't get in any other way if you did it via a Zoom conference, for example.
Well, that is true. It elevates the importance to a place where it should be. I think that's right. But then again, if you want to get your voice heard when there are 100,000 voices there, you have to figure out how to do that in the right way. So I think finding a balance is important. I don't think anybody, well, actually people are questioning the importance of COP, and I think that's why we're talking here. But this is an important event. I think we should, state that clearly. It's worth doing. We can discuss the outcomes and the impact in the end, but it's important to actually meet and talk and exchange views and information in a constructive way.
Because, if we look back, it's quite clearly the case that the big agreements that we kind of think about that have had real effects on people's lives, the economies, the way we live our lives, even have happened at COP, and it has boiled down to individuals making agreements at that point that have then gone on to be implemented. So, the Paris Agreement is the most obvious example of this. Were you in the room in Paris when that was implemented or discussed?
No, I was at the Paris meeting actually, and typically I go on the first week of COP, where there is much more interaction with regard to science, and the big negotiations and the big decisions are typically happen on the last second, or maybe day after the last second of the meetings.
Oh, yeah.
When I've gone home already. So I've not been on these historical moments when they swing the club and everybody celebrates.
Oh yeah, the sort of stopping the clock thing at the end of COP, where Sunday lasts for 4 days or something. I think by that stage people are pretty tired. You kind of wonder how much that impacts on decision making quality. But there you are. So Toste, you mentioned that you typically go for the first bit, not the second bit. Could you just unpack a little bit, what the sort of, the chronology of the about 2 weeks actually is? I mean, how does it work?
So the first week is much about the subsidiary bodies. So in the first week, the SAPSTA that I just mentioned, the subsidiary body on scientific and technological advice, will meet and take decisions. This is a time when scientists' voice are going to be heard. That leads into the main negotiations. The second week is then more to the bigger negotiations. In this year, it was about finance. And then it's typical where the heads of states are coming maybe for the opening of the first week, and then coming back towards the end of the negotiations. So I see my role very much on the first week to give scientific information and advice. And even though it would be really fun to be part of the second week, it's, I wouldn't have a role, I wouldn't have a voice really that strongly during the second week.
So I remember that as a scientist, one of the high points for me was the annual presentation of the global carbon budget, which is the culmination of a load of effort by a lot of people across the world, working in all realms of planetary science, who collectively come together to deliver an estimate of what the world did with carbon in the previous year, both in the sort of natural sense and so how the natural cycle is varying, and the human component of it, of fossil fuel combustion. So I mean, I found that extremely exciting, seeing that presented. And in theory, of course, it could be something that you could make a decision on. I mean, if you discovered that that this year's budget had been a particularly standout one, for example, you could take some corrective action. But in practice, I think that's a really optimistic way to look at how the system works. Do you have a sense for how that scientific evidence actually drives change in anything like real time, or is it just much slower burn?
I think it's a much more slower burn, but it's also for us scientists an important milestone, right? We really would like to have the global carbon budget ready for COP. We want to have the paper published, or at least the preprint published, which is, an important deadline for us to do. But I would like to emphasize another event that's called the Earth Information Day. That's now a mandated event where scientists and science are reporting the latest state of the climate to the delegations. And the first time I went to a COP was in Marrakesh. That's probably about 10 years ago, where we introduced this concept. I wasn't one that invented it, but I was invited to give a talk on the ocean at that COP. And after a few years, the SAPSTA, they found that it was such a useful event that they now has this as a mandated event. Each year on the COP, there is half a day where scientists and the WMO and other bodies are actually giving the latest updates. The world has warmed so many degrees. We have so much carbon dioxide, so much methane. etc., etc. So many hurricanes, they are more intense. Whatever you want to say, that is the place where you give that information and have ample time for question and answers to the delegations. So I think that is a progress, that this is now a mandated event, that the politicians are coming there and not just thinking about reducing emissions from factories and traffic and other stuff, but also thinking about what are the impacts on the natural environment.
So is that well attended, that event then?
It's not as well as you would like to. You see some delegations there. There are, of course, all the scientist bodies listen to the other scientists, right? But those are not really the audience you would like to have. But I see it more and more. Usually one of the big conference rooms, this event, and there are numbers of delegations there and politicians, they're listening. It's a couple of hours and they get the latest information on the state of the climate on the Earth system. So I think it is not as well intended as it should be, but it's getting better attendance every year.
Okay, well, Toste, that was a really kind of interesting opening section. I'm sort of wondering, though, you've been to a lot of these things and you've met a lot of scientists who've been to a lot of these things. Do you think there's a sense amongst the science community that it's really something that you go to because you feel you have to, because you want to get your voice heard? Or are there some sort of, benefits for individuals in actually attending?
Yeah, the COP is not really for the benefit of scientists. I think most scientists would be much happier if they didn't have to go to the COP, if that wasn't an issue. It sometimes gets a perception in the public that, climate science is something that we made up just to have, something to do and get, a next grant funded. It's not at all like that, right? Of course, there is a benefit for a scientist to go and meet other scientists and meet politicians, and you can get your message across. But the whole COP and the whole UNFCCC is not for scientists, it's for societal benefit. And we as scientists has the duty, actually, that's what we get paid for, to advise in this process. Of course, as a scientist, by having this framework, we have a deadline, we get asked what to deliver. It gives us a mandate to do climate observations and climate science and deliver that at a COP. So in the end, it is a benefit for scientists, but we rather not have it. It's not that we want it. So I think the question is good, but it's really not for science, it's for humanity and the public good. And we as scientists are providing guidance in that process. We are not the politicians, we don't take the decisions, we are not going to implement the natural determined contributions, but we can give advice on that. But, back to you then, Richard, I mentioned the societal benefit, and maybe you can say something about what you think is the benefit for society of having these COPs.
So that's a really interesting question, and one that I think is actually quite hard to answer because we don't have the counterfactual. We don't know what would have happened in a world that didn't have the COP because we've been having them. But if you look back in time, I saw an interesting piece of analysis that suggests that our projections of what fossil fuel consumption and combustion would have been made in the past, we have made progress against the rather bleaker projections. So the increasing realization of the importance of the climate emergency, of the role of human activities in driving it, that the COP is both symbolic of and generates, has led to a sort of a reduction in fossil fuel emissions by some countries. So there are a group of countries now that have actually managed to reduce their carbon emissions, and they've employed a variety of tactics and strategies to do this. But at the heart of them, I think, has been this process that the COP drives of countries getting together and agreeing that this is an important issue that we need collectively to do something about. I mean, of course, there's a lot of discussion about who does what and whose responsibility it is and who's going to pay and all this sort of stuff. But the core principle that is reinforced annually, that this is something we need to take seriously, that we need to collectively engage in doing something about, does come from the COP. So I think in that sense, I would say there has been a benefit to society from, this activity. In terms of benefits to scientists, well, I think over my, 30-odd year research career, climate change has moved from being a sort of an intellectually interesting problem that we were sort of theoretically aware of to something that really is something that drives our professional lives very, very strongly. And we spend a lot of time thinking about and how to engage in the sort of plethora of important activities that contribute to supporting our decision making, as you described. So things like the IPCC process are extremely important. Things like compiling the global carbon budget are extremely important. And we tune our activities to delivering into those important activities as well. So I think I'm kind of with you that, in a sense, it would be a good thing if it didn't happen, because it would mean that climate change wasn't an issue to worry about. But it is something to worry about. And so as a result, we take it seriously, for better or worse.
Yeah, Richard, this is a really good point. And I would like to add something to that. And I think the whole process of having the regular COPs in the framework convention in the first place is that these discussions and these decisions and the NDCs for nations and so on are actually driving investments from businesses and from governments. So it's much more than the scientific curiosity that we talked about 30 years ago. It actually drives substantial investments in future technologies and away from old technologies. So it has big impact on society and businesses. And what we now see is that, for instance, renewable energy is cheaper than most fossil energy right at this point. And that would not have happened, I think, if we didn't have the convention and the regular COPs.
Yeah. I think sometimes we don't collectively appreciate how ambitious and challenging to deliver the sort of collective targets that we've set ourselves is going to be. We've spent an awful lot of energy, or we've derived an awful lot of energy in the past from fossil fuel combustion, and maintaining our society, maintaining the way that society operates in anything like its current format. But simultaneously transitioning to low carbon energies is going to be an extremely large challenge. And, it's really clear that all sectors of society have to participate in that somehow. And that underpinning it will be a massive technological revolution that we probably haven't seen most of yet. It's hard to conceive of what it will be like. Here in Norway, the number of electric vehicles is just staggering, and it's not just cars; it's big trucks and ships, and but because it's happened incrementally, it's kind of hard to realise what a transformation it's been and what it's going to be going forward.
Yeah, interesting. I was reading an article about the electric vehicles in Norway yesterday, and I think it was 95% of new registered vehicles are electric. And in the German perspective, we are so far behind. So we're looking with awe to Norway. How did you manage to do that? But I think, looking at one of the scientific numbers that goes into the COP now, which is a really interesting part I've found, is that if you look at the carbon dioxide emission per person, it has remained kind of constant the last 20 plus years. So that means that we are, increasing our standards of living and so on, but we're using less carbon dioxide for that. The reason that the carbon dioxide emissions increase and the concentration in the atmosphere increase is that we are more. So we are increasing our standard of living. We don't use more carbon dioxide per person on average, but we are more people, right? So we are trying to stop a train that actually accelerates.
Yeah.
We have to get it to go level and then starting to slow down, but it's still accelerating. It's still speeding up.
It's still speeding up, but if pursuing that analogy perhaps too far, there's many different trains, from different sectors of society and different countries, and some of them are slowing down, and that does give us some sort of hope that we can do this. This is not an impossible challenge. It's a extremely challenging one. But as you say, at the heart of this, or at the heart of delivering this, the solutions will be businesses, because those are the organisations that have the capacity to do large scale activities like producing new technologies, like reorganising the way that we work so that we spend less carbon getting to our place of work and these sorts of things. It's pretty fascinating actually seeing how society is, albeit slowly, kind of like, beginning to take steps towards the transformation that we kind of think is needed. It's interesting you talk about Norway and electric vehicles. There's a variety of reasons, but I think there's a tipping point. I mean, there are many tipping points, and tipping points in climate is something we could talk about in a different podcast. But I think there's been a tipping point in societal behaviour with respect to electric cars. They're not these exotic, newfangled creations anymore. They are just kind of the normal car. And government has, invested a lot of money in creating incentives, but so too have private businesses in putting in place the infrastructure that's needed for charging, and the result, you can see it on the streets.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Richard. I mean, the technology is out there. It's just the willingness to move to the new technology and leave the old technology behind that needs to move forward. I think looking back at 30 years or 29 years of the climate convention is that we would be in a completely different place if we didn't have it. And what we really need now is for the partners, or the parties as it's called, parties of the convention, to actually live up to the promises. That is what's missing. We have all the nationally determined contribution, the NDCs, but very few nations are actually living up to them.
Yeah, which is strange because a lot of them, some things that you can do to decarbonise your economy cost you real money, but actually some of them save you money. Almost regardless of your perspective on climate change, saving money by insulating your house better is a kind of a no-brainer, really. But of course, for individuals in society, there are kind of upfront costs. So this argument that you invest now to save money in the future is great at a kind of a national level, or for somebody who's got the sort of financial freedom and flexibility to kind of make that investment. But if you're not living in that space, then although it's theoretically a good idea, it can be really tough to find the investment to do that. And I sometimes wonder if it's those sorts of things that underpin this massive focus on climate finance that we're seeing now.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting perspective, talking about your individual house, but talking about nations. It's very clear that the upfront costs of mitigating climate change will massively overshadow the long-term cost of not doing it.
Yeah.
So it's a more political question. How can a politician that is, elected on a 4 or 5 year cycle motivate investments that's going to be, pay out in 30 years' time? And that is just a fundamental problem, I think. So that is really what government will have to take that discussion and do that. That is what we have governments for. And looking at businesses, I think the businesses really will like that 20, 30-year perspective too, guidelines. I think that is one of the reasons, for instance, that the car manufacturer business in Germany has not really moved into electric vehicles as they should have done. And even the infrastructure in Germany, because it's going back and forth. What is the long-term plan for the EU to move into electric vehicles, right? I mean, you hear one thing 1 year and 2 years later, there is a turn back and turn around on that decision. So that long-term planning is so important, and we're going to get the businesses, we're going to save money, we're going to create new jobs. But the problem, of course, is that there's going to be some jobs in the current industry that's going to fall away, right? And that's always a change that causes angst.
So it's interesting. We started this by talking about the COP, and I kind of imagined we'd segue into natural science, but actually most of our conversation has been around, how society is going to reorganise itself to cope, which is, a pretty interesting thing. I wonder, though, whether us diving into that line of a conversation kind of somehow indicates that that this is just as much a kind of a coupled social human, I was going to say problem, a social human issue, as it is a scientific one. We're both scientists, so we come at it from a science perspective, but a lot of climate changes or climate change policy is linked to the behaviour of individuals, I think.
Yeah, in addition to the social and scientist, I would actually add economic. So that is the three ballparks. And I think what we have achieved the last few years in the COP is to put natural science much more central on the agenda. We have been able to tell the politicians, if you want to reduce carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, yes, you have to reduce emissions, but you cannot forget the natural system that takes up carbon. And the ocean, as we know, takes up, a quarter of current emissions. So that is obviously a very important part of that puzzle. And on the COP now, for the third year this year, has been an ocean pavilion. And you haven't seen that, Richard, because that was before, the COP in Scotland, after the COP in Scotland. And I think this has been a really pivotal change for us in ocean science, to have that ocean pavilion where we can talk about ocean issues and kind of explain to the delegations that, climate change is ocean change.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, the ocean does play an utterly pivotal role in the global climate system, taking up carbon, storing carbon, and increasingly people are beginning to look at it as a solution to climate change as well. This carbon dioxide removal industry that we're beginning to see the emergence of, has a massive ocean presence, I think. There's some huge... Does the discussion of the CDR industry figure strongly at COP, or is it still really focused on managing emissions?
No, CDR is getting more and more importance. Clearly, an ocean CDR, marine CDR as well. So that is a big topic. And I think it's clear that we will not be able to even get the 2-degree goal if we don't massively increase CDR efforts. And we scientists have a big responsibility there when it comes to guiding what kind of CDRs we want to do and what kind of impacts that will have on the natural system. But I also think that the realization that the natural sinks will not stay constant is kind of sinking in. And, I used to use this analogy. If you think that the ocean takes up about 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year, which Richard probably agree on, something in that order at least. And the societal cost of carbon dioxide is 100 euros per ton. I like easy numbers, right? So 10 times 100, I can do that as 1,000. That means there's $1 trillion question, right? There's $1 trillion worth of the uptake of the ocean in carbon just every year. And if you don't know that number, how can you then manage climate change?
Yeah.
Richard, you are a director of ICOS. Imagine you were a director of a much bigger company and you had $1 billion turnaround a year, and you go to your board and tell them, we had $1 billion turnaround, but maybe it was 750 or 1,250. I don't really know. They will kick you out of that conference room right away. But this is exactly what happens. For us, we are not able to tell our delegations more than, plus minus 25% or something like that of what the ocean is doing on the carbon budget.
Yeah, we have a lot of tools that we can bring to bear for that. We have models and we have a variety of observing platforms. And when we do our best analysis of all that data, we still end up with substantial discrepancies. And as you say, that uncertainty introduces uncertainty into the sort of political decision-making process. If we know that if we don't know the size of the sink, how can we be certain it's changing? If it is changing, then how fast is it changing? How much extra mitigation do we need to do to compensate? These are, questions with big financial implications, and not being able to provide data prevents us being able to kind of do those calculations accurately. one of the biggest challenges, of course, is that the ocean's big and it's quite heterogeneous, and we can't be everywhere all the time. So we're forced to rely on a whole lot of different platforms other than just ships. And it's quite clear that civil society has a big role to play in that, as in so many other things. I mean, you've been pioneering this take up of carbon dioxide sensing by commercial or by racing yachts, and I think that's been a real success story that can hopefully lead to a much greater kind of acceptance of that sort of work by the regular ocean community as well as just scientists.
Yeah, Richard, I think that's a really good point here. We have this new project Precursor that you're leading that's going to start in a month or so, and one of the objectives of that is to engage that non-scientific actors that have assets on the water, like cruise ships or racing yachts, to make these observations. And the fun part is that we do have sensors that are good enough to do that now, and we have seen that the efforts we have done so far has actually paid off, and we have a much better, even though it's not good enough, a much better understanding of the carbon uptake of the ocean.
Yeah, so I'm really hopeful that those sorts of interactions with non-scientific platforms will really lead to a much better characterization of the ocean carbon sink. And of course that will have a knock-on consequence, which is that any work we can do on understanding how the ocean sink is changing leads to a much better understanding of what the land sink is doing, because the land sink is the difference between what accumulates in the atmosphere, what the ocean takes up, and what we emit to the atmosphere. And so, there's multiple parts to this kind of global carbon cycle problem. And learning about one sector doesn't just impact your understanding of that sector, it has a broader application as well. There's been some pretty interesting suggestions around the land sink and how it's changing, particularly at high northern latitudes. So there's a lot of work to do there.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Global Carbon Project started to actually do their own modeling of the land sink, but I don't think that's very accurate. And taking the difference between what remains in the atmosphere and what goes in the ocean is probably just as good or maybe better. So that is a very hard question to quantify the land sink. The ocean sink is much easier, and I think we could do much better, Richard. The 25% uncertainty, we can trim down to 10%, I think.
Yeah, well, that's a big goal. That we, we need to set ourselves targets in the scientific community in the same way as society needs to set itself targets around climate activities. My own sense is that the reducing that uncertainty, it's not one big bang that we need, but a kind of a systematic program of kind of looking critically at all the parts of the calculations that we do. The skin effect that's very popular at the moment as being a potential thing. But, there's lots and lots of parts of the calculations that we can probably do better. Wind fields at sea is another important issue because, the rate at which CO2 is driven into the ocean is in part a function of the strength of the wind, and getting good observations of wind over remote parts of the ocean is actually, as with so many things in life, much more difficult than you think it would be.
It's not just a matter of getting more sensors on sailboats. It's many, many things that we need to do, of course. But collectively, I think we have a good understanding on what these things are and how to go about it. So it's a little bit a matter of getting the mandate, I think, from bodies like the UNFCCC to actually go out and create this observing system that in the end not going to deliver data on carbon dioxide, but going to deliver us data on the fluxes, right? That goes into these budgets and understanding of the cycle.
We're seeing some really important developments in that area at the moment. The WMO, which is probably the only international organisation with the convening power and the reach into meteorological offices, has decided or been encouraged to create what is termed a global greenhouse gas watch, and that holds great promise for catalysing the investments in observing technologies and observing systems and organising the efforts of the disparate countries around the world to kind of work together to deliver the information streams that that have been identified as critical for managing the future evolution of climate. So the WMO is, it's in a sort of an implementation phase, but they have this very long timescale perspective that you mentioned earlier. It's envisaged that this will go on for 60, 70, 80 years. Who knows how long we'll need to keep measuring CO2 in the planetary system.
Yeah, really good points there. Coming back to the COPs and the UNFCCC process, one of the frustrations here, I think, is that is based on consensus from almost 200 partners or parties on the convention, and we always see a couple of countries try to push their own agenda and interests ahead of the best of the common, of the all, and that is really what's causing a lot of frustrations, I think. It would be great, I think, if there was a coalition of the willing that could actually move ahead and actually implement solutions. And another possible format here is G20, so the 20th richest countries of the world. And they just met in Brazil just after the COP in Baku. And climate change was on the agenda there, even if the decisions were a little bit, unspecific. I think, moving in areas like the G20 or maybe G7, I think G20 is responsible for something like 90% of the global emissions. So in a smaller group, you could probably go into action.
Yeah, I haven't thought too much about that, but there's nothing to stop. There's nothing to stop individual nations kind of like taking action. But of course, there is a tremendous sense that that if you take action and others don't follow, then they'll be benefiting somehow from that process. I think ultimately this is kind of a collective leap of faith that we all have to make. And if most people make it together, then hopefully the kind of like the others will come along behind.
Sorry, I don't quite agree with that, Richard. I think that one country can move ahead and go ahead, but it has a cost, right? Because if you want to do mitigation activities in your nation, you're probably going to cost your money and it's going to make your businesses potentially less competitive. So I think that is the big issue. If we in Sweden or Norway want to make green steel, that steel is going to be more expensive than conventionally made steel, right? It's going to have less carbon dioxide, but it's going to be competitive drawback that the government will somehow have to compensate for. So that is the benefit of going together. But yes, if you do that in a G20 format, that would be another way of doing it, I think.
Yeah. So that's, I know that the G7 is very active in these sorts of things, in this sort of collective action space. And it's encouraging to see that the G20 wants to kind of like start, working together as a collective in that sort of area. But overall, all of that needs to kind of like, for me, sit somehow in the sort of COP environment, because that's where the whole world comes together. And actually, for all its faults, I think I'd be interested in your perspective on this. For all its faults, I'm not sure that we've got a better way of kind of like trying to achieve the consensus that we probably need to achieve to really move, strongly on the climate issue, which is getting pretty serious now, actually.
I don't think there is a better way of doing it. And the big advantage of the COP is that it takes everybody on board. For instance, the small island developing states that are highly affected by sea level rise, for instance, but they are definitely very small economies. They will never be in any G20 or any group like that, but they have a voice that's equal to the voice of Norway or Germany in UNFCCC. I think that is the really big strength, and we need to keep the UNFCCC and the COPs. But I think still, if there is a coalition of the willing that actually move forward or implementing stronger what has been agreed on already in the UNFCCC and COPs, I think that would be a good combination.
Yeah. Ultimately, I suspect there's no substitute for, for people with influence and power awarded to them via democratic processes, kind of getting together and in the small hours of the night, really kind of agreeing collectively about the targets that we need to do. And I don't think there's anywhere better that we've found yet to achieve that consensus than the COP process.
So Richard, this was really interesting conversations. What are your 3 main takeaways of demystifying the COP process?
Well, I guess one of the things that's come out of this conversation for me is the extent to which the COP isn't just or isn't even mainly a science event. It's really a place where I think scientists can kind of get to supply information that elected representatives and policymakers need to make better decisions. And it's clear from talking to you that it's, although it seems slightly chaotic and messy, there is actually a core of real structure and organisation at the heart of it. So you can be sure that if you engage in the COP process, by which I mean not just the COP itself, but also all of the implementation that takes place through the year, then you can get your voice and the nuggets of information that you think are important kind of heard in the process. So those are the kind of like the big messages that have come out of this conversation for me.
Oh, no, I think COPs are a place where all nations that are parties of the convention can meet and discuss, even the small and poor nations, and particularly those, their voices are being heard. And I think from a science point of view, we should not forget the IPCC process that provides really important input every 5 years to the process. And now every year we have the State of the Climate report coming up from the World Meteorological Organization. So these are the main conduits for our scientists to actually provide the guidance and information to policy when they meet at the COPs to take the decisions and move forward.
So thanks for that. I think that's a great note to finish on. But just to say that we'll probably try and run another podcast in the not too distant future on some of these other parts of the intergovernmental machinery, the IPCC process, and the various other reporting mechanisms that we have that in the OceanICU project we're contributing to in a small way, so that interested people can learn more about those bits of the process as it unfolds.
This work was funded by the European Union's Horizon Europe programme and UK Research and Innovation under the UK government's Horizon Europe funding guarantee. Views and opinions expressed are, however, those of the authors only and do not necessarily reflect those of the European Union or European Research Executive Agency. Neither the European Union nor the granting authority can be held responsible for them. For more information on OceanICU's funding, as well as other project information, please see the website oceanicu.eu.